Good morning. This is Mortality with Meep, and I want to talk about excess mortality or excess deaths, how I'm defining it for my own posts, how actuaries usually define it, and where there can be issues. So I'm going to be going over my last three blog posts because I've been focusing on mortality this week and last. Going to be doing a few more before I get back into public finance and public pensions again. So let's just start with my base graph, and I'll make it a little bigger. Actually, let's see, open it in a new tab. There we go. Okay, so let's look at this. This is our base structure. Now, this has the average 2017 to 2019. In a later graph, you'll see I use the average from 2015 to 2019. I'll talk about that in a moment. But first we have our base mortality, and this is, again, remember, all deaths, all causes. Broken up, and this is the way the CDC was reporting it. Yes, we can get more detail, but usually that comes a few years after, once the CDC has, cleaned up the data and properly anonymized it and that kind of thing, so that you can get at it via Wonder. People who get I don't want to go through this because I'm not an academic. You can get at the microdata, but you have to sell your firstborn child. No, I'm kidding. I don't want to do the paperwork, and again, I'm not an academic, so I'm not going to go jump through the hoops for this. In any case, so our three-wave structure that I've been talking about all this time, but we have these different layers of number of deaths by age. Now, of course, that's not how the population is distributed among these ages. The 85 plus population is actually pretty small, but most of the deaths come from that population, even in a normal year. Okay, but first we start out with our total, and now I want to look at, okay, what's excess? Okay, so we'll go to the next one. And this is for all ages. We're going to open that image in a new tab. So I have my total deaths, and then I was comparing it against the average from 2017 to 2019 and calling the difference between the 2020 deaths and the 2017 to 2019 deaths as the excess mortality. Now, that's how I'm defining it. I take the total number of deaths versus a recent average over multiple years. Now, I could have compared it just to 2019. That actually would have been a fine comparison as well. That said, what I was trying to do is make a comparison against something that has been smoothed out, and averaging, of course, smooths out any kind of volatility you just get from normal randomness week to week in any particular year. Obviously, there is a certain amount of randomness, not just COVID, going on with the deaths in 2020. And I have commented about, some of these ups and downs. I see this in October, are really being influenced by North Carolina dropping out of the data set in October when I pulled this. And yes, I will not shut up about North Carolina sucking on this score. In any case, when I have been doing this relative excess mortality, so this is percentage higher than that average, you'll notice I don't do extra decimals. Obviously, I have numbers, but that's a false precision, again, because of randomness, and also because, is this an appropriate definition of excess mortality? The reason I did it is reasonable in terms of 2015 to 2019 or 2017 to 2019. The number of deaths that we expect year to year usually changes by only a few percentage points. So when we look at a case where it's 40% higher than recent years, that's excess mortality. It doesn't matter that it's 40% or 43%. What's the difference at that order of magnitude? It's more that I am trying to capture the trajectory rather than the the 6 decimal place, and kind of comparing the different peaks that we're seeing here. So we see that first very rapid rise, very high, very excess mortality. But then in the summer one, we see this, it's more spread out, it's a lower down. And like for the winter one, it's not clear to me that it really is a lot lower down. And besides, this is number of deaths for all of them. What about by age group? Okay, and so let me go down here. Yeah, and so those are my prior videos. So let's just skip over that. And again, starting from here, and in the next post, I did compare against the 2015 to 2019 average. Sorry, open image, new tab. So I'm actually just going to flip between these two. And there's not much difference. I'm sorry, these are the same scales, and like pop, 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 pop. I changed the colors somewhat, and the age ranges changed for the younger ones because of the data set I was pulling from. And the data set I pulled from gave me number of deaths by these specific age ranges for 2015 through 2019. So I was able to do the average for each age group. Okay. But one of the things to note is this first part in January. Boom. The average for 2017 to 2019 was higher than 2015 to 2019, and that's because deaths in January 2018 were high due to a bad flu year. And when I say bad flu year, I just mean it was within the regular bad flu years, and we had a prior one, I think 2013, 2014. Around there. It's like every 5 years or so, there's a bad flu year. So if I average over 5 years worth of mortality data, it tamps down the effect of that one bad year. Okay. So now when I do excess mortality by age, so open image, new tab, take a look. So we look at this, and first off, stacked columns don't work quite right in Excel, because if you have both negative and positive, because the total, and this is I've run into this with regards to public pension underfundedness. If they're all positive or all negative, then they can stack up. Then they can stack up. But it doesn't really do it right when some of them are below and some of them are above. And so what we can see is in January and February, for the oldest ages, 85 years and older, there were fewer deaths compared to that average. And again, that's because it was a mild flu season in January 2020, and it's a mild flu season right now. When deaths really took off in April 2020, then you totally see everybody's excess mortality goes up. And we can see the numbers. Actually, we see the numbers are pretty high for 75 to 84 years old and 65 to 74 years old. Now, the number of excess deaths for the younger adults for 25 to 44, is pretty low. It contributes some, but it's not a lot. However, we have to remember that's just in absolute count, not relative. Not very many, percentage-wise, of those aged 25 to 44 die each year. So when I did a percentage, and I'll open that in a new tab, and that in the new tab, image a new tab, okay? So for those over age 65, you can see, we had excess mortality about 50% for that group, and then in the subsequent waves, it really came down. Still a little high, but like 85 years and older, it came down to 20% excess mortality in the summer. Still, it's a lot of excess mortality. Here's the thing. We expect a lot of deaths from each of these age groups each year. Okay. Most of the deaths come from these age groups, especially 85 years and older. So yes, a lot of the 2020 deaths came from there, COVID or not. And here we go. It all looks like it's the same trajectory. But for 25 to 44, take a look at that. Okay, it's pretty high, but you can also tell it's pretty volatile for 25 to 44. The under 25 years, it's very low and pretty volatile. It's hard to draw conclusions from these, though, and this is why. It's because if you look at how many excess deaths there were per week, it's on the order of hundreds as opposed to thousands, which is what we have for the oldest age groups. But the number of deaths per week we expect for those groups are in the hundreds. It's very low to begin with. So there could be randomness here. Yes, I think that there is a lot of extra mortality that we will eventually suss out coming from suicides, homicides, and we do know homicides were up for 2020 in the US. Suicides, homicides, and drug overdoses, and there's definitely evidence for increased drug overdoses by a lot in 2020 and coming from younger adult age groups. But the problem is trying to draw inferences when you have a low expected value to begin with. And again, I'm just going by numbers, not rates. If I had used rates, and this is actually how actuaries tend to define excess mortality, is we will do a ratio of actual deaths to expected deaths, but the expected is based on our pricing expectations, reserving expectations. So when we say bad mortality, it just means worse than we had originally expected. It does not actually mean compared to the prior year, because we may have expected mortality to improve. If we expected mortality to improve and we got mortality exactly the same as the prior year, that would actually be considered bad mortality experience because it was worse than we expected. And it is very, and we do break it out by age buckets too, because it is, if there was some bad mortality for those age 85 and up, tends not to have as big an impact as bad mortality in the age 25 to 44 years old group, for obvious reasons. Some of this is showing up in group life experience. The Society of Actuaries has done a study, and that is where I would be expecting the bad COVID mortality experience really to show up in life insurance and not the oldest ages. Because in the oldest ages, we're expecting a lot of them to die anyway. Okay, but yes, a lot more of them died than before. So when we develop our rates and expectations, we actually implicitly have kind of confidence intervals around them. We often will, for life insurance, put in a margin where we're expecting, where we have a margin for within randomness in that confidence interval of mortality. And the smaller the group, okay, so the smaller the number of insured lives, or the smaller number of expected deaths, as with younger ages, you actually get a wider confidence interval for how many deaths in a relative sense, because all it takes is, say, 2 deaths, 2 extra deaths over expected to really throw you off. And the reason I'm talking about this is my most recent one, and I'm not going to get into this. So let's do it by racial and ethnic group. So open this one in a new tab. So I did a similar thing, and I first off for the CDC data I had, there were 6 groupings by race ethnicity. The problem is 3 of those groupings had so few expected deaths, or average deaths in prior years, that I could not, in good conscience, graph what those percentage differences looked like, because I think there's too much randomness. And the other thing is, probably for those groups, looking at the average number of deaths in prior years is not a good way to set expected. It is good for these 3 groups: non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic black, and Hispanic, because those are thousands of deaths per week that we got in 2015 to 2019. So while there is some noise, and I believe, again, that October noise for non-Hispanic black, I think a lot of that is being influenced by North Carolina not throwing in. But this is to set up. In my next post, I'm going to dig into specific states, the 10 largest states, including New York City. And I don't want to look at smaller states because once I start getting into, I mean, you can tell Rhode Island, way too small of a population. And their Black and Hispanic population, even if it's a large percentage, even if it were, and it's not, the number of deaths they have in those buckets each year are really small compared to, say, non-Hispanic whites. But even there, you get a lot of randomness. As well, what can drive changes in patterns between states are if a lot of people are moving in and out of the states. This is not going to have a huge effect at the oldest age groups. It's not like people over age 85 are doing a lot of moving around. It's more in those age buckets or racial categories where you don't have a lot of people to begin with, and all it takes is a few thousand people moving or hundreds of people moving to throw off the statistics. Now, that's not really going to happen a lot with deaths, but it can with cases, for example. So I have to stay focused on the largest states, so California, Texas, Florida, New York with New York City, Pennsylvania, Ohio. We get, let's see, we have Illinois, obviously, North Carolina, Georgia, and they're kind of from around the country. So we will have some on the West Coast and the South, Southeast, Northeast, and Midwest. So, and those do have different racial distributions as well as age distributions. But I'm going to focus on what these patterns look like by race and ethnic categories. But we always have to keep in mind, in some of these states, the particular group may be very small. The larger the group, so for example, in Texas, there's a very large Hispanic population, same for California. So we can take a look at the number of deaths there. However, say, the Black population in some of the even large states, it's a very small percentage of the population, except, so for example, New York State, the Black population in New York City is substantial, but in the rest of the state, not so much as a percentage of the population. And that's not quite the same as the Hispanic population in New York State. So we need to keep these things in mind when we're looking at these statistics. When I do these percentages, we need to be aware of whether that's a large percentage of a small number or a large percentage of a large number. And that's what I think some of the dynamics going on in this graph. The non-Hispanic white population tends to be older for the entire United States. So most of the extra deaths are coming from those over age 75. And most of those people, that's an even whiter population than the younger populations. But also, it's where this first spike, a lot of that is really New York City. Most of the excess mortality in that first wave was centered around New York City. So the ethnic impact is going to be really influenced by what the ethnic diversity of New York City is. So, these are the things I'm thinking about while I'm doing the statistics. We always have to keep these in context. If we look at these numbers without thinking, well, what's really going on below here, you can come to some conclusions that actually aren't supported by the data. So I will be digging into these. Look forward to talking with you all about it more. And I'll do another video once I do those state analyses. And I'll be doing it over several posts because it can get very long if I have 10 states in a row. So maybe 5 and 5, or split it up in a way that makes sense. So see y'all.